Okay, so here we are with the third reading this week, and this is on the financialization of the American economy. And this is essentially the rise of consumer and debt culture. So the focus question is, how did American financial institutions encourage Americans to get themselves into debt, and why? So this reading is largely on the rise of debt and debt culture in America. Again, this relates back to the inflationary period, the changing economic period of the 1970s, when more and more Americans found their wages under pressure, but at the same time found that borrowing money made a lot of sense, because if you could borrow money and then pay it back with devalued dollars, you could, in a roundabout way, come out ahead. So the 1970s were really the beginning of the rise of consumer debt on a massive scale in America. Money sitting in a savings account was actually losing value, so it was better to spend money. And it was even better to spend money you didn't have, because you would pay it back with devalued dollars. And this led to the rise of credit. We'd actually talked about the rise of credit in the 1920s, but this is the rise in credit on a much larger scale in the 1970s and on. And you can see here the rise of American household debt from 1975 to 2005. So Americans became investors in a sense, believing that rather than having their money sitting in savings accounts, it would make more for them well spent. And this new consumer culture was directly marketed to the middle class. And if you look at advertisements from the 1970s, a lot of them have this aspect to them where it encourages you to buy things that have value as a type of investment against the falling value of the dollar. And if you look at TV advertisements in the 1970s, they're very focused on consumer culture. So spend your money now before it loses value. And indeed, the late 1970s were an economic boom time because of this. But at the same time, this is essentially an economy growing on borrowed money. In my Discover New York class, which I teach at St. John's University, I often show the movie Saturday Night Fever. And Saturday Night Fever very much so captures this world of money being worth less and less, the economy being unstable, and this consumer culture being a new factor in the American economy. And here we have the rise of stock investment, and how stock investment was another way in which Americans could access the financial institutions, the financial instruments, and spend their money rather than sitting on it. So this, of course, then leads to household debt in terms of home ownership. And we can see here the rise of subprime mortgages in the 90s through the 2000s, which eventually caused the subprime mortgage crisis, which caused the last recession, which for many of you happened when you were children, but believe me, it affected you whether you realized it or not, and it definitely affected your parents. This happens because rising debt causes essentially a bubble where you borrow more and more, but eventually you can't pay it back. And then when you can't pay it back, the bubble bursts. And this was more encouraged by a new type of pooling households' debt, slicing it up and selling it as different kinds of securities to to people on the stock market. So we have Americans getting themselves into debt with no real way to get themselves out of debt. And for this reason, the stock market's often called the casino. Wall Street's often called the casino. So this reading talks about the rise of consumer culture and the rise of debt culture in the United States. And this next part of the reading talks about the Great Recession, which again affected you whether you realize it or not. For many of you, you were children at the time, but for those of us who were adults, many of us lost our jobs. And like I said, even if you don't realize you were affected, you were. And your parents definitely were. And here we have the decline in incomes during the Great Recession, many of which have not really recovered since. Wages have only started to recover from the wage loss during the Great Recession. So this talks about the rise in debt culture, the financialization of the American economy, and the Great Recession. Which brings us to this week's activity, which is on college graduates in the labor market. Now, I've already made this available for you on the discussion boards, but make sure you are reading the full reading, the background, and the sources. And then you can find, this is our videos, of course, you can find over on the discussion boards, this week's discussion board. All right. So hopefully this has been helpful to you, and I will talk to you guys next week or later this week, as the case may be.